Thank you, members, for your indulgence, and to our witnesses for waiting for us to get going. Welcome to meeting number 73 of the Standing Committee on Science and Research. Today's meeting will be taking place in the hybrid format. Members are attending in person, and we do have Mr. Lobb online. Welcome to Mr. Lobb. And while I'm doing welcomes, I can also say welcome to Ms. Kayabaga, who's a new permanent member of our committee. You can speak in either official language. Interpretation is available for the meeting either in the room using the earpiece provided, or if you're on Zoom, you can choose English, French, or floor. For members in person, just be careful with your earpiece to make sure it doesn't get close to the microphone so that we don't have any feedback on our translators, and thank you to our translators for the work that you do for us. If you can address questions through the chair. I think we'll get started now with the meeting. Pursuant to Standing Order 108.3.1 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, September 18th, 2023, the committee resumes its study on the integration of Indigenous traditional knowledge and science in government policy development. It's my pleasure to welcome our witnesses today from Environment and Climate Change Canada. We have Patrice Simon, Director General, Wildlife Landscape Science, Dominique Henry, research scientist, Cheryl Ann Johnson, researcher for wildlife ecology. You'll be happy if you could present to us in 5 minutes, and then we'll go to our questioning round. Looking at the clock, we should be able to get a round of 6 minutes in for each party in the room. So if we can go to 5 minutes, Mr. Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this invitation to speak about the use of Indigenous traditional knowledge in addition to Western science in federal government policy. Je veux profiter de cette occasion pour...
I'd like to take this opportunity to say that today I am located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin people.
Director General of the Wildlife and Landscape Science Directorate within the Science and Technology Branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada. The importance of conducting interdisciplinary research and considering different knowledge systems is increasingly seen as critical in science. We are the largest scientific research organization on wildlife in Canada. Our team of scientists conduct research across the country on issues related to wildlife and their habitat, including driver of population change, health, disease, and contaminant, focusing on species of federal responsibilities. We apply many novel approaches and methods to address urgent wildlife conservation questions, including genetic and genomic techniques, Earth observation and remote sensing technology, ecotoxicology method, high-performance computing, and machine learning and modeling. We also work with Indigenous knowledge. Our team collaborates with Indigenous people across Canada for its collection and interpretation. J'ai le plaisir aujourd'hui d'être en présence de deux...
I'm here today with two of our lead researchers, Dominique Henry and Dr. Cheryl Johnson. They spent a large part of their career working with Indigenous knowledge and how to weave it into scientific advice. I would like to ask them to describe the work that they are doing that demonstrates their commitment to co-developed research with Indigenous partners and using innovative and inclusive approaches that bridge, braid, and weave Indigenous knowledge into scientific research that leads to more fulsome knowledge. Dr. Henry undertakes research that addresses Indigenous community priorities related to wildlife, climate change, and cultural heritage. She leads an interdisciplinary research program aiming to mobilize Indigenous and Western knowledge systems on culturally significant species under federal jurisdiction, in order to support wildlife co-management and sustainable use, particularly in Arctic and northern Canada. Dr. Johnston is an acknowledged national expert on caribou who has been instrumental in developing the identification of critical habitat requirements for the recovery of boreal caribou. She has spent 10 years co-generating knowledge with Arctic Inuit communities for the identification of critical habitat, including sea ice, for the threatened Peary caribou. Dr. Henry up to you. Thank you very much, Patrice. Good morning. I am pleased to attend your committee meeting this morning. My name is Dominique Henry.
Environment and Climate Change Canada with training in human geography and anthropology. As a non-Indigenous researcher, I've had over the years the privilege of working with and learning from many Indigenous elders, leaders, scholars, hunters. Most of the projects I've contributed to have taken place in Inuit Nunangat, Inuit homelands within Canada, and I've focused on species that are culturally important to Inuit, especially polar bears, Nanook, light geese, and common eider ducks. Our research program relies on community-based, community-engaged, and participatory processes. Indigenous partners actively take part in decisions about the research at every project phase, from design to interpretation and sharing of our results. We employ social science methods, such as interviews and participatory mapping, to gather and document Indigenous knowledge and science about the environment and human-environment relationships. We then create spaces through workshops, sharing circles, where Indigenous knowledge holders, social scientists, natural scientists, and decision makers can engage in interdisciplinary and intercultural dialogue. We weave together Indigenous and Western sciences through collaborative research with the ultimate goal of supporting wildlife co-management and policy development. We work closely with Indigenous partners to ensure that our research supports free, prior, and informed consent, as well as Indigenous data sovereignty. We are committed to involving and training Indigenous youth to enhance Indigenous research capacity and foster intergenerational learning.
Okay.
In this way, not only is Indigenous knowledge documented through our project, but importantly, it guides and drives the research process.
Thank you. I think we'll have to call it there because we are at 5. And we will start off our 6 minutes with Ms. Rembel-Garner.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Simon, would your department have responsibility for informing the content of recovery strategies for species listed under the Species at Risk Act?
The department, yes. Our group provides science advice to be considered by the recovery team of species
Great.
at risk.
I read a paper, it's Hill, Schuster, and Bennett, 2019, Indigenous Involvement in the Canadian Species at Risk Act Recovery Process. It said that fewer than half of recovery strategies show evidence of any involvement of Indigenous people in their preparation, and involvement varies drastically among regions and federal agencies. Would that be a correct assessment today? It was published in 2019.
Yeah, probably there will be better people than me to look at, do this assessment. I know we're working on several of the key species to provide science advice that considered also Indigenous knowledge. So I don't know the specific of the answer there.
Thank you. And maybe we could, if there is some detail that can come to us later in writing, would be great. Ms. Rembel-Garner, if you could move a little closer to the mic, the translators.
Thank you. Sorry, blocking the sound. How many Indigenous or First Nations person are directly employed within your directorate?
I don't have the stats by heart. We have research scientists that are non-Indigenous that will work on Indigenous knowledge. We do have scientists and staff that are Indigenous that also worked on it. We have just created a new division, an Indigenous Science division within the Science and Technology branch that have, they're probably a group of around 10, and I think all or most of them.
What percentage would that be of your entire unit?
Excuse me?
It's okay. I guess I'm also looking at how Environment Canada would incorporate concerns from various First Nations, Indigenous groups about recovery strategies or the listing of species.
Yeah.
About 2 years ago, there was pushback from various First Nations groups regarding a decision to list the black ash tree under the Species at Risk Act. How is it that a decision to list a species under SARA could get to the point where First Nations groups have to say no, that this is not, like, how did it get this far down the path? At what point? I'll leave it at that.
The way I see it, there's different process that Indigenous groups are at the table. I'm looking at, when I see Indigenous knowledge, it's not consultation. They're building the research, they're providing the evidence, and that's inform a decision. And when there's a decision, there's a process for consultation that is about the decision. Not sure if that's clear. I have one of my I have Dr. Henry that works on several species, including polar bear, and maybe she can go in some detail.
Looking at the process, because I think what often happens is, and it's not just your department, oftentimes policy happens to First Nations rather than with First Nations. And I just worry that the current process for, especially even looking at recovery strategies for species at risk, perhaps don't adequately take into consideration cultural context of First Nations early enough in the process, particularly when it comes to traditional practices and rights like hunting. Would you say that's an adequate characterization?
Well, I think I'm more aware of the one that we do. On caribou, for example, and I'm talking caribou, polar bear, because I do have the expertise on both sides of me. But I think they're involved at the beginning in the design of research, in the priorities, all the way to, and often they have they have a role in the decision-making process as well. So,
is that role, at a senior level in terms of saying?
Well, again, it depends a bit
or is
where.
It more of a checkbox exercise?
Well, it depends where in Canada. Again, now, if we look in the Arctic, there's the co-management boards that have a very important role in the decision-making process.
But it's not consistent across the country.
It's not consistent across Canada. You're right.
Okay. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll move to Ms. Medlage Diab for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming. Monsieur Simon, you started to say that there's a new Indigenous division. Would you please elaborate on that? Tell us when it started, what it does, and how do you use Indigenous traditional knowledge in the decision making to develop policy?
Okay. Maybe I'll back a little bit. Environment Climate Change Canada has been kind of working collaboratively to collect Indigenous knowledge for quite some time. It was done as part of Western trained scientists for some time, and then over time we got people that are more expert, like Dr. Henry, a social scientist, to really focus on that, but also help the rest of the group to do that. I think it was about 12 months ago that there was an Indigenous science group that was started up, and it's still in building. There's the directors, managers have been hired, some research scientists, and that they have, I have a bit of an element of their work plan, working on the diversity of things, not only wildlife, but ecosystem health, predicting weather, assisting in identifying target for biodiversity objective, these type of things. So the group is building up, and this is just to provide, to inform decision by using various knowledge system. So quite a bit, for a long time, it was focused on Western science, and we are developing more capacity to look at Indigenous science to inform policy and decision based on these two.
Thank you. Dr. Henry, can you tell us what you do and just give us some examples of specifics to your work and what you do and just to give us an idea?
Certainly. So I'll speak about polar bear for a moment. So for the past 8 years now, I've been engaged in a study working together with local hunters and trappers organizations based in Nunavut to collaboratively sit down and speak about the expertise that Inuit polar bear hunters have and that women specialized in polar bear hide cleaning have, to write this knowledge down, to assess polar bear health using metrics and indicators that are used by hunters on the land, such as looking at polar bear body condition, how many bears there are, how fat, how skinny, etc. And then at the end of the day, we write down all this evidence and we submit this to decision makers, policy makers, that will then establish, for example, polar bear harvesting quotas based on Indigenous knowledge, based on the evidence we gathered through this study, and based on Western science as well. As Patrice mentioned, under comprehensive land claims agreement areas up north, you have co-management systems whereby it is a mandated responsibility, mandated legislation to have Indigenous knowledge and Western science both included in the decision-making process. So that's where research supports the process. And I think this is a great model of how resources are invested to support the building of evidence from both sides. Because I think a key to the future of this approach is really to invest in capacity, like we are doing right now within ECCC, with the Indigenous Science Division. For a long time, Western sciences have had a lot of voice, and I think it is imperative nowadays that Indigenous sciences and knowledge systems do have equally powerful voices in the research realm and in the policy realm. Thank you.
How has the Indigenous science changed, perhaps, what would have been done without it, in your opinion? Yes, I am, because you're working on the grounds with it. So yes.
So Indigenous experts living in communities, traveling on the land, offer year-round observations of ecological phenomena that oftentimes are carried and shared through generations. Often, Western scientific studies offer snapshots in the time. Inventories are conducted periodically, only during certain seasons, whereby Indigenous hunters and experts are the eyes and the ears of the environment and the changes we see, especially at a time of rapid climate change in the Arctic regions. I think people on the ground provide us with really in-depth expertise.
So, Ms. Johnson, I know you didn't get a chance to sort of, can you tell us what you do in the department?
About 30 seconds.
I work on species at risk. My main research is focused on generating the knowledge to inform recovery strategies and then the required monitoring that comes after you develop a recovery strategy or an action plan. And so my experience with Indigenous knowledge, like Dr. Henry, has occurred mainly through partnerships with Inuit communities. I work with 10 different Inuit communities that are implicated in the recovery of Prairie caribou.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, but we're at time. Monsieur Blanchet-Jolka, for 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, witnesses. My first question is for Mr. Simon. We looked at Bill C-69 properly and in depth, and it requires a lot of work from your department. Bill C-69 also requires taking into account Indigenous knowledge in the Impact Assessment Act, but also in the Canada Energy Regulator Act. You said in your opening remarks that there are two systems of knowledge. You talked about comparing Western science and Indigenous science, and to say that these two sciences are assessed differently. I would like to know what is different from a form of knowledge discovered by an Indigenous person and a non-Indigenous person. Thank you for the question. I think that the systems of knowledge are complementary. Indigenous science is more based on observation, as Dr. Henri is saying. These people have been there for generations, and they have a way of handing down knowledge from one generation to the next. This is done through storytelling. Western science is based on academic studies and stats and probabilities. Often, scientists look at the same issues and make realizations that can be observed, and you can see truly interesting things to learn once you can take both systems into account. Okay, you said that these two are different. You said that you cannot use the Western science within the framework of an Indigenous science. So from a Western perspective, the method is validated by generalized measures. No matter who does the science, what country or what person, this is the universal definition of science. What I would like to understand is from an Indigenous point of view, you are saying that this does not apply. So how can we validate Indigenous knowledge? You said in response to a question from my colleague that the Indigenous people provide the evidence, there is no consultation. So if the scientific method that we have is not applicable, how then can we validate these observations from Indigenous peoples? I think that there are several ways, but I'll let maybe my colleague, Dr. Henri, or others, Dr. Johnson, do you have examples? I will answer in English if that doesn't bother you, because reasons.
Easier for me. So one of the ways, because we'll go through interviews and we'll have workshops, and so through that process, a lot of information and knowledge is shared. One of the ways of sort of making sure that our interpretation and representation of the knowledge that was shared with us is correct is by going back and having multiple interactions with people. A lot of work with Indigenous groups, organizations, like it's all built on partnerships. So you don't just have one meeting and then your job is done, right? You have this knowledge base. And then you go back and you make sure that your interpretation is correct, that you're applying it correctly. And then if you're wrong, you have to change it based on the feedback you get. So that would be one example of how the process we would use. And it's iterative. So we don't just go back twice. Sometimes it's 3-4 times.
Je comprends, Madame Johnson et Madame Henri.
Just to understand, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Henri, you can both answer. Has it already happened in experiments to see observations that something that could be possible but ended up not being true? You said that there are consultations and that you've asked people, but on the ground, in reality, in science, we really want to look at if something is valid, if it's good or not good. And now this is a whole other field of knowledge, because you said that the systems that we have cannot be applied to Indigenous science. So I'm trying to understand, how do you distinguish something that's true from something that is false? You say, yes, we're consulting people, but I can tell you, hey, I consult people too, but you cannot necessarily ascertain whether something is true or false. I would just add something to help answer your question. I think it's a very complicated question. There are similar things between Indigenous science and Western science. Indigenous knowledge, as I said earlier, is based on observation, on hypotheses, based on reoccurring observations. It's just the methods that are different. Notes aren't taken when people go hunting, but the notes are made in people's heads, and there are hypotheses that are created with regard to various animal populations. So I think we need to take this into account. The scientific method is something that is applied in all peoples, no matter what their ethnic origin is. All science is based on observation, but the methods are different. Thank you. No time.
But thank you, Mr. Cannings, for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, and thank you for being here today to tell us about this important topic. I think I'm going to turn to Dr. Johnson just because I think you've been cut off a couple of times, and I want to give you more time to explain what you've done. I know, I read that you've been in this position for a number of years, 15 years or so, and you know, I was involved in ecosystem recovery plans and species recovery plans back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And this concept of bringing in Indigenous knowledge was kind of in its infancy in policy terms. And there was, when I was on Kasiwak, there was some very slow progress in that regard. I just wondered if you could perhaps maybe expand a bit on what you do now and what you've seen over the years you've been working in this space. What trajectory are we on? Is it a good one? What have we learned? That sort of thing.
I would say that things have definitely changed over the years. So when I first started working on Prairie Caribou, I would say, going back to one of the earlier questions, it was somewhat unique. So in the scientific published literature, North America has been somewhat criticized with respect to some of its recovery objectives for species at risk, because the bar is being set too low to allow for Indigenous rights, et cetera. And one of the things that we did with Prairie Caribou is when we set the recovery objective for the species, it was done in partnership with our Inuit partners, which means, and if you look at the Prairie Caribou recovery strategy and you look at those recovery objectives, there is a specific statement in there that speaks to allowing sustainable Inuit harvest. So maintaining populations not at the minimum that would prevent them from going extinct, but at a level higher that allows Inuit communities to harvest those populations. And so, and that's just one example where we kind of set the bar a little bit higher, and we've continued to build on that. And so, for example, the identification of critical habitat, which is the habitat you want to protect for species at risk, has partially been fulfilled for Prairie Caribou. So Prairie Caribou have to move between islands. So sea ice is a really important part of their habitat. For some people, talking about sea ice is a little bit difficult to make that relationship with habitat, but it is habitat for them. And so there is no Western science to inform where these species move between islands. The protection and the identification of that critical habitat in terms of sea ice is based solely on Inuit knowledge. And that is their contribution.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I remember one anecdote I heard where Western science said Prairie Caribou had suffered a catastrophic decline, and the Indigenous knowledge said no, they went to another island or they crossed into another area. And that sort of knowledge was indispensable in really getting the real picture. Is that an accurate recollection of mine?
I would say that's still debatable.
Okay.
But it goes back to a point that Patrice made earlier. It's the complementary of the two knowledge systems, right? The Arctic is very hard to monitor, survey animals, very expensive. And so our information about Prairie Caribou numbers it's sporadic at best. You combine that with people who've been on the land, who are intimately aware of this species and have this long-term knowledge of trends, and you get a much better sense of how numbers have changed over time and why.
And do you work on other caribou populations, porcupine herd, boreal, and is it the same kind of situation?
I do work on boreal, and it is not the same. It was very different.
In what way, in terms of indigenous knowledge and the use of?
So originally when I started, you have to remember it's probably 10 years ago when I started working with boreal caribou, there was some discussion about how we might weave in indigenous knowledge into the process of developing the knowledge base for boreal caribou recovery. And there was some discussion with indigenous partners because the boreal is huge, it involves a whole bunch of different indigenous, Métis, Inuit. Not everyone agreed on how indigenous knowledge should be should be part of the recovery process, and so it was different. Whereas with paired caribou, it was very clear from everybody agreed.
Okay, I'll just leave it there, but thank you.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cannings, for your in-depth questions there, and to Dr. Johnson for being able to provide your experience. And thank you to Patrice Simon as well as Dominique Henry for your expertise at this meeting where we're discussing the integration of Indigenous traditional knowledge with the government policy development. If there's any further information, please do submit it in. We will be suspending for our next panel of witnesses. We have 3 witnesses online. 2 out of 3 sound checks have been done. We're going to try and do this turnaround quickly so we can get into our next panel. So for now, Mr. Lobb, just hang on. We'll be with you shortly. And to our witnesses, again, thank you for your contribution. We'll suspend for just a couple of minutes. meeting. We do have committee business after this session, which is scheduled for 30 minutes, so we may have to cut into that a little bit with the indulgence of the committee. Welcome back. A brief reminder for our virtual participants to speak in the official language of your choice. Interpretation services are available. You can choose on the bottom of your screen either Floor, English, or French. If interpretation is lost, please let me know and we will suspend while we get that, or we'll pause while we get that sorted out. We have two witnesses. We have got the successful sound check. The third one will continue to work with, the technical staff will work in the background to try and get that sorted while we continue with the meeting. Pursuant to Standing Order 10831 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, September 18th, 2023, the committee resumes its study on the integration of Indigenous traditional knowledge and science in government policy development. It's my pleasure now to welcome as an individual Danica Littlechild, Assistant Professor at Carleton University. We also have Talicho Government, Tammy Steinwald Deschambault is Director of Department of Cultural and Lands Protection. And we also have from the Government of the Northwest Territories, Heather Sane Crawford, Director of Wildlife Management Division. You'll each have 5 minutes for your remarks, and then we'll go to our rounds of questions. So for 5 minutes, if we could start off with Danica Littlechild, please.
Hi, Tansatoya Kakeo Kinanaskom Tenawa Utapian Tumiak. My name is Danica Littlechild, and I'm a member of the Ermineskin Cree Nation, the Asqueyak of Musqueam and Treaty 6 territory in Alberta. I'm an assistant professor at Carleton University in the Department of Law and Legal Studies. I believe the committee has already received a lot of testimony communicating the what and why of Indigenous knowledge. My testimony will not attempt to define Indigenous knowledge for the committee. I believe Indigenous peoples themselves ought to be able to define what Indigenous knowledge means to them in a self-determined and autonomous way. Instead, my testimony will focus on making recommendations related to how we can integrate Indigenous knowledge and science into government policy development. My central recommendation is that the committee propose the development of a formalized mechanism or mechanisms, possibly legislated, that provide autonomy to Indigenous peoples in design and substance. I have participated in many standard-setting processes, including law and policy development in Canada and internationally. In my experience, the methodology that produces the most constructive and useful advice is one which is Indigenous-led. For example, the Indigenous Circle of Experts under the Pathway to Canada Target 1 had autonomy over the report and recommendations they produced, which has led to a proliferation of Indigenous protected and conserved areas in Canada, and I would say has influenced conservation policy significantly. One of the exemplars of how to accomplish the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in government policy comes from Alberta. In 2016, the government of Alberta legislated monitoring and reporting requirements that included establishing parallel advisory panels to advise the chief scientist and the government of Alberta on Alberta's environmental science program. There is a science advisory panel and an Indigenous wisdom advisory panel, which advise the chief scientist and the GOA regarding how to respectfully apply traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous wisdom to Alberta's environmental science program. I provided support and facilitation for the Indigenous Wisdom Advisory Panel mandate and rules document, which provided a framework to accomplish appropriate advice. I've attached that document to this presentation. A long-standing international exemplar comes from the Convention on Biological Diversity, to which Canada is a party, which is the first and most long-standing formalized mechanism for the inclusion and integration of Indigenous knowledge. The fact that this is a legal obligation has led to very rich standard-setting outcomes around Indigenous knowledge that have shaped international policy on biodiversity, as well as many other fields of work internationally. I recommend that the committee utilize existing legislation such as the implementation framework around the right to a healthy environment under Section 5, Part 1 of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which provides for ministerial advisory bodies. And I would also recommend that the committee characterize this work as supporting the implementation of the Government of Canada's United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act Action Plan 2023 to 2028. In conclusion, I would say that this process is not about mainstream science trying to master Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science. We do not want to create onerous burdens on existing and future mainstream scientists to try to learn Indigenous knowledge systems. I wouldn't ask a scientist to spend 3 days with me to teach me about a scientific concept, then walk away saying that I had mastered the science behind it. Just as mainstream scientists spend lifetimes mastering their fields of work, so Indigenous knowledge holders similarly spend lifetimes learning and becoming knowledge keepers on their lands and waters. So my recommendation is that the committee express their respect for a multiplicity of knowledge systems in play and avoid creating artificial binaries, us and them, or circumstances where we're asking one knowledge system to legitimize another of which they have no understanding. The idea here is to simply elevate Indigenous knowledge systems to a position where they can influence and shape the development of government policy and to review existing government policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Littlechild. And before we go to our next witness, maybe Ms. Steinwald-Deschambault, technical is trying to get in touch with you, so if you could maybe get your phone handy, they can try and sort out the technical issues. And we'll now go for 5 minutes to Heather Sane Crawford. For 5 minutes, please.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I have the privilege of working in wildlife management in the Northwest Territories. I work in a field which brings out a lot of passion. I work side by side with a wide range of people who truly care about wildlife and the decisions we are making for conservation. I'm extremely happy to be working in a system that includes and values Indigenous knowledge and perspectives in wildlife management and conservation. The GNWT exercises our responsibility for the stewardship and management of wildlife and wildlife habitat through a well-established co-management regime that provides the direct involvement for Indigenous governments and Indigenous organizations. This co-management regime is implemented in conjunction with a broader GNWT traditional knowledge policy, which requires the GNWT to consider available traditional knowledge in all environmental management actions and decisions. Here in the NWT, we have co-management boards or renewable resources boards, which have been talked about earlier. They have been established as the main instruments of wildlife management in areas where land claims have been settled. There are 4 such wildlife co-management boards set up under 4 separate land claim and self-government agreements in the NWT. Outside of those settled land claim areas, we work in the spirit of co-management to ensure the input and involvement of other Indigenous governments and Indigenous organizations in wildlife management. We have 2 pieces of legislation that provide tools to help conserve wildlife and its habitat, the Wildlife Act and the Species at Risk NWT Act. Both pieces of legislation were co-drafted over a number of years using a collaborative working group process that included participation by Indigenous governments with settled land claims and their established co-management boards, as well as Indigenous governments and Indigenous organizations who did not have finalized land resources or self-government agreements. This approach led to legislation that is based on collaboration, legislation that recognizes and respects Aboriginal and treaty rights, as well as the spirit and intent of land claim agreements. Both the Wildlife Act and Species at Risk NWT Act formally recognize and put traditional knowledge and science on an equal footing. What this means in reality is that the processes we undertake recognize the value of having open, informed discussions about wildlife management approaches. That may mean being presented with concerns or divergent views on an issue such as harvest quotas. The co-management system allows for discussion based on the best available local, traditional, and scientific knowledge and open and frank discussions on what can be done to address an issue and the possible implication of those actions. One unique approach we have taken in the NWT is our species status reports, an approach to assessing species under consideration for listing under the Species at Risk NWT Act. As part of the NWT's process, species status reports are produced by a Species at Risk Committee. They include 2 parts, an Indigenous knowledge component and a scientific knowledge component. Each section represents a consolidation of the best available information within the scope of each knowledge system. The preparation of each status report is guided by separate instructions tailored to each knowledge system. Trying to amalgamate the 2 knowledge systems tends to compromise the interpretation and accuracy of the information. In the next step of the process to consider possible listing, side-by-side or dual species assessments are conducted, one based on Indigenous knowledge and the other based on scientific knowledge. Each knowledge system specific assessment is informed by the respective component of the status report. This structure helps ensure each knowledge system's autonomy, uniqueness, and validity are represented and respected. Key highlights from this dual assessment process include knowledge-specific criteria that are considered one knowledge system at a time. All members of the committee, regardless of the knowledge system that best represents their expertise, participate throughout the process, allowing experts in different fields to learn from one another. The final species assessment can be supported by criteria from either or both knowledge systems as appropriate, and we can expect the knowledge-specific assessment to sometimes result in different results. For example, one could say special concern while the other says threatened. There are no steps in the dual assessment process intended to prevent these differences. Rather, it is designed to encourage respectful conversation among committee members who represent a diversity of worldviews and who are committed to working together for the species. In addition to these examples, the NWT also uses a wide range of collaborative forums and processes where the GNWT participates with other co-management partners as one voice at the table. Examples include a number of Caribou Management Board, like the Beverly and Kamanuriak Caribou Management Board, the Bathurst Caribou Advisory Committee, and the Porcupine Caribou Management Board. These boards bring together biologists and Indigenous holders from Indigenous governments, Indigenous organizations, and the GNWT, working together to share what they know, determine herd status, and identify management actions to support herd management. Equipped with both sets of knowledge and worldviews helps these boards make better decisions that reflect the values and realities of the NWT. Merci Cho for your time today.
Great, thank you. Right on time as well. We're still having trouble getting a hold of Ms. Steinwald Deschambault, so we haven't been able to resolve the technical issues. So we will go to our round of questioning as we continue to try and get in touch with Ms. Steinwald Deschambault. For the first 6 minutes, over to Mr. Tucker, please. Oh, we're back. Sorry, to Mr. Lobb. Sorry. Mr. Lobb for 6 minutes, please.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all our witnesses for being here today. To Miss Littlechild, my question to you is, I did some reading on your work, and the one topic I'd like you to expand on for the benefit of the committee in the report is your writings on ethical space, and just elaborate a little bit to the committee about that.
Certainly. Ethical space is a concept that was coined by a mainstream philosopher actually in the 60s, which was then adopted by Cree scholar Willie Ermine, who published a few documents about it and was further adopted and practiced by Elders Reg and Rose Crowshoe of Piikani in Treaty 7 territory. And it's from them that I learned the practice of ethical space, which is essentially a different methodological approach to understanding how to co-create new relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. One of the things that ethical space asks us to do is to reassess our own positionality relative to various issues and tries to give sort of an elevation to Indigenous systems without being interfered with by the mainstream. So in other words, ethical space is not about trying to adapt mainstream systems to fit Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous systems, which are often oral or verbal systems and not written systems, and which also collaboratively talks about the different kinds of standards that will be reflected in the dialogue and interaction between the parties. Ethical space also provides room for diversity of knowledge systems. In other words, it isn't about creating that binary that I was talking about earlier, the idea that all Indigenous knowledge is one. There's a reason that there's an S at the end of peoples in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That S took 11 years to negotiate. And the reason that it's there is because we are not a homogeneous group. We have a high level of diversity, and ethical space really calls upon us to recognize that diversity. Thank you.
Just to follow up on that, is there an area in society or in government policy where you feel like the concept of ethical space could really be a game changer for Canada?
I certainly think that there is an interest and a willingness on the part of many federal departments with which I have engaged over the past several years to work in a construct like ethical space to co-develop new policy. And so certainly I have engaged with Parks Canada, with ECCC, and I believe that there is, a lot of foundational work that has already been laid. I mentioned some of the legislation, which I think is relevant to this this conversation, but I think also that we have reached this critical juncture where we're talking about the implementation of a framework like the UN Declaration, which has been described by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada as the framework for reconciliation. We have this existing set of standards that I think we can draw upon and which the Canadian government has already legislated quite a bit about. So I believe that there is a lot of infrastructure already in place that we can utilize to engage with this type of approach.
Okay, for my last remaining time, I'll ask Ms. Sayen Crawford. I can go back years ago when I first got elected, and there were different things around government policy that were burdensome, and it was red tape, and it didn't make a lot of sense. And I just wondered, is there an approach that we can take with some of the Indigenous practices and knowledge that we can relay back to government to say, okay, you have good intentions here, but it's actually, you're completely wasting your time. This is a better approach to take for the natural environment and for society as a whole.
Thanks for that question. I was happy actually in listening to the last session that there were some questions about the species at risk process, and because I'd planned on giving some evidence on what we've done here in the NWT and taking a different approach, working with people, hearing the problems that people had, so specifically around the species at risk assessment process, finding that it was an overly technical assessment process that Indigenous knowledge didn't fit into, right? So our processes have been heavily informed by the IUCN and CSIWORK processes, and once we started working through that and sitting at the table with traditional knowledge holders and experts, they started to say this doesn't make sense for us. So how do we change it, right? And so working together to sit and understand each other's points of view and working to change the system to make sure that we all have an equal footing. I think it's just those relationships, those discussions are really important in changing the bar and moving things in the right direction.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the questions and answers. Now over to Mr. Turnbull for 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses that are here today. I think this is our last panel on this topic, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right, Chair? Yeah. So it seems that your testimony today is a nice way to start to finish off this work, although it's kind of sad that we're completing or coming to the completion of it. I found it to be very, very informative and fascinating to hear all the testimony. I wanted to sort of get down, I'm trying to sort of convert some of the things that we've heard to the most practical kind of recommendations that we'd like to see in the report coming up. I really appreciated the comments that were made by Ms. Littlechild, I think, about ethical space. We had some comments from a previous witness, Carol Levesque, I think is her name, that I think worked on Dialogue, the Indigenous Peoples Research and Knowledge Network. And she had talked about spaces of interconnection and interaction. And in some of her description of creating those types of spaces, it sounded quite similar to the concept of ethical space. But my question is, how do we convert that to a federal government policy-making process? in real practical terms, like what can the federal government do to create more spaces of interconnection and interaction where we really do, I think, get the benefit from both knowledge systems without one sort of subsuming the other or assimilating the other, but ensuring that it's with mutual respect. Ms. Littlechild, could you maybe remark on that, and then maybe I'll go to the other witness. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. I think that ethical space is a useful methodology because it is something that is not a prescriptive approach. It is co-created by the parties who have chosen to enter into ethical space together. And so it has been very, very useful in arriving at some very rich outcomes. So, for example, we utilized ethical space in the province of Alberta in some of the work that I did in health there. We worked with the province and the federal government to, through a methodology of ethical space, to arrive at some very significant outcomes in a trilateral nature in the context of policy making and standard setting around Indigenous health. We've also used it in the Joint Committee on Climate Action, which was a committee that was co-appointed by the Prime Minister and the Assembly of First Nations, wherein it was used to talk about how to understand the integration of Indigenous knowledge in the context of climate policy and climate action in Canada. We have also seen it used in a number of research fields. So it is formalized in the context of the Tri-Council guidelines on research with Indigenous peoples. It's actually in the first part of the chapter on Indigenous peoples, and used to actually, I think, form part of the CIHR guidelines that predated the Tri-Council guidelines as well. So ethical space is not really a new concept by any means in Canada. It's been used quite broadly and widely. There's a lot of different iterations of what ethical space might look like. And I don't think that's something to be concerned about. In fact, ethical space is something that's intended to be co-created for a specific outcome or in a specific process, understanding that different parties come from different perspectives, and helping to create institutional change to work towards reconciliation. It is not about privileging one party over another. It is actually about trying to create a mechanism that prevents that problem that we've seen and that I think forms part of your mandate, which is talking about, the possibility of systems clash. And the Alberta example that I raised, which has a parallel advisory panel approach, also is reflective of ethical space because the same issue would be presented to both panels who would consider them in the context of their own chosen mandate and roles in accordance with their own expertise and practice. And then the outcome of both panels would then be presented to the chief scientist in the government of Alberta as a way of informing policy development and implementation, and an ethical space in a context where there would be dialogue and cross-validation of those outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you for that very good and detailed answer. I really appreciate that because I think it will enhance our report coming out of this. Ms. Saine Crawford, hope I pronounced your last name correctly, but I wanted to go to you and sort of, you've suggested a number of things as examples based on the government of Northwest Territories and your work. I wonder, what recommendations would you have for the federal government in adopting some of the practices that you had mentioned in your opening remarks? It sounded like the dual assessment process was quite significant. Can
I'm
you
afraid-
relay any learnings to us quickly?
If you could do that to us in writing, we're over time now, but thank you for the question, and if we can get an answer in writing would be great. We're now going to try to have Ms. Steinwald Deschambault provide her testimony for 5 minutes. We'll have an eye with our interpreters to make sure that our technical solution is working. So Ms. Steinwald Deschambault, thank you for your patience, and for 5 minutes to you, please. And you have to go off mute, please. There we go. There we go.
I would like to begin by saying merci to the Standing Committee on Science and Research for inviting us to share our thoughts on traditional knowledge and science and government policy development. Traditional knowledge, or Tlinchol Nawo, is a concept that encompasses language, culture, and way of life, that includes traditional laws and ways of being that are used to understand and navigate through the world we live in. This knowledge helps us to live in harmony with all other forms of life. Tlinchol Nawo is rooted in our intimate connection with our land and animals. Generations of experiencing through close observation of learning how elements, environment, and wildlife interact with one another has helped our people learn and build traditional knowledge to better understand our changing world. Tlinchol Nawo is constantly expanding as the elders of each generation add their observations, experience, wisdom, and insights to what is already known. Tlinchol Nawo has been and continues to be preserved and shared with others through oral narratives and more recently through documentation. The Tlinchol government has taken a leading role in researching, integrating, and utilizing traditional knowledge in the co-management of caribou populations here in our part of the world. Caribou have been our way of life since time immemorial, therefore are very important to our people. In 2016, the Tlinchol government's Boots on the Ground Caribou Research Program was created. We, the Tlinchol people, wanted to know for ourselves why the caribou population continued to decline. Since this was our research program, we set our own research agenda and priorities using the methodology of We Watch Everything. The Tlinchol Nahuatl program, as it is known now, is rooted in Tlinchol Nawo. Elders have been born and raised out on the land, are instrumental in all areas of this research. As a team out on the traditional lands of Mofwegora de Nitle, we begin our research work by acknowledging our higher power and his creation by making offerings to the land to give thanks for all that we have, to request a good season of research, safety on the land, and protection from all elements. By conducting research on our own, we have control and ownership of the process. To effectively integrate Tlinchol Nawo into government policy, we collaborate with universities and government agencies. In these collaborations, it's essential that the agenda and research objectives are driven by the community people. In the Tlinchol region, we have an established co-management system for managing the land and caribou. Tlinchol Nawo plays a crucial role in caribou management, particularly as an advisory committee member for the Bathurst and Blue Nose East herds. Here, Tlinchol Nawo and science are integrated and complement each other in determining the status of caribou herds. The herd status level identified by Tlinchol Nawo and science suggests which management actions are to be recommended, which in turn guide government policies to be implemented. Tlinchol government works to incorporate Tlinchol Nawo into decisions regarding resource extraction projects for mines, roads, and power lines. For these projects, we integrate Tlinchol Nawo into the design of proposed resource development projects to minimize disturbance and mitigate impacts to caribou and the land. While Tlinchol Nawo and science are different methods and produce different results, the results often complement each other by addressing gaps that the other cannot fill. Science fly planes over and count caribou, which Tlinchol Nawo does not. But Tlinchol Nawo has a long-term, intimate knowledge of caribou and the habitat, which science does not have. Thus, results can complement each other. When used side by side, both contribute to a more complete and comprehensive understanding of the caribou. As a long-term vision, Tlincho government emphasizes including youth in Tlincho Nawo research. This ensures transfer of knowledge from elders to youth and helps maintain the crucial connection with our land. Merci.
Great, thank you. I'm very pleased we were able to get your testimony. It's very helpful for our study. Now over to Monsieur Blanchet-Chocat for 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, witnesses. First question is for Ms. Littlechild. I listened to your opening remarks. I found it very interesting and very detailed. I also saw that in the experiment you led, or rather in your background, you worked at UNESCO, and congratulations on that. I would like rather for you to help us pull apart a few notions. First of all, when we talk about Indigenous knowledge, is there a universal definition of what is Indigenous knowledge?
No, there is not a universal definition. And I think part of that comes from the fact that, in reference to my earlier remarks, Indigenous peoples are not a homogeneous group. There is a high diversity of Indigenous peoples and the different kinds of knowledge systems that they hold. Just as we see other knowledge holders, scientists, different types of scientists have, different types of knowledge. Different cultures around the world have different knowledge systems. Similarly, there's a high diversity of Indigenous knowledge systems. And this is why my recommendation to the committee was that the committee specifically recognize in the context of their study the fact that this diversity is difficult to reflect in a brief study, and to talk about the need for Indigenous peoples to have the self-determination to describe their own knowledge systems.
Je vous remercie de votre réponse.
Thank you for your answer. With the definitions that define Indigenous knowledge, do those definitions include spirituality or religious beliefs?
I believe that some do. I think the resources that will be of the greatest utility in this line of question will be those standards to which Canada has already agreed. So, for example, Canada is a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which does have, I believe, some definitions around what is globally considered to be Indigenous knowledge. We can also perhaps look to some of the existing legislation in Canada to look for those definitions. But I do not think that it's a useful use of time for the committee to try to come up with a definition, which, to be quite frank, has been challenging the global community for decades, for the simple reason that it's incredibly difficult to come up with a pithy definition for knowledge systems representing over 470 million people globally.
D'accord. J'aimerais vous entendre.
I understand. Can you talk about the following example? You said that Indigenous communities are not monolithic and they're not homogeneous. You also said that beliefs and the spirituality could be included in Indigenous knowledge. What I would like to know is, how do you distinguish what's true from what's false? Because let's say one community has a belief, then public policymakers want to define policy and they need to trace a line in the sand. How do you think that policymakers can incorporate those experiences in our current system?
Thank you for your question, and I've heard you ask many witnesses this precise question, and you've gotten a lot of different kinds of responses. I think for me, the crux of your question relates to the fact that you seek to create, it sounds as though what you are trying to find is a way of legitimizing or confirming knowledge from different systems. And I think this is fundamentally impossible, which is why I think you've received so many different responses. So as I said earlier, it's very difficult to say, I can confirm something is true from a system to which I have no understanding. So my example earlier was, if I sit down with a scientist and ask them to explain a complex scientific concept to me for a period of 3 days or even like 3 workshops, I don't think I could walk away from that saying that I had verified that this complex scientific concept was indeed true from my own Indigenous perspective. Similarly, I think on the flip side, it's pretty well impossible for non-Indigenous systems to try to somehow verify or confirm the veracity of Indigenous knowledge systems. And we can see that the courts in Canada have also struggled with this. So we have some sort of challenging tests that the courts have laid out, 10-part tests around how do you define something that is central to your Indigenous identity, for example. And all of these tests have, for the most part, for many years, relied upon social science evidence, for example, like finding some kind of usually non-Indigenous study to confirm it.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt, but thank you for the answer. We're over time, and Mr. Cannings, for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for being here today. I'd like to quickly go to Ms. Sane Crawford. Very interested to hear your words on Species at Risk, Northwest Territories Act. I've been involved with the federal Species at Risk Act for many years, and I'd just like to give you more time to dive into that. And first of all, how does it align legally with the federal act? How do they work together in the Northwest Territories?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So our Species at Risk NWT Act is applicable in the NWT. There are some fundamental differences between our act and the Federal Species at Risk Act, but ultimately I think that they do complement each other. We have in the past used federal recovery strategies, management plans, or species status reports to help inform our own processes here in the NWT. For example, our latest management plan for northern mountain caribou relies heavily on the management plan that was developed federally and included information from the Northwest Territories. So I think the main difference is here we work in a collaborative system, and I talked a lot about the co-management regime, which I think parallels the ethical space that has been spoke about today as well. Looking to bring everyone to the table to meet and discuss first the status reports, the assessment, and finally listing. So a difference with the Species at Risk NWT Act is just that there are several management authorities, including those co-management boards under the settled land claim agreements and the GNUT, and also space for all other Indigenous governments and Indigenous organizations in those decisions.
Well, thanks. And you mentioned that you structure your assessment process and perhaps the recovery planning process differently than the federal process, in that there's essentially 2 paths, the Indigenous knowledge path and the scientific path, or whatever you want to call that, and they kind of remain separate throughout the process, whereas in the federal process, Indigenous knowledge, there's Indigenous knowledge committee on Kasiwik, there's, that information, they attempt to try to bring both those knowledge pieces together to form a final assessment report and recovery plans. And you seem to intimate that didn't work as well as your method. I'm just wondering if you could expand on that. I'm very interested in hearing that.
Yep. Thank you for that question. So I think it touches on some of the things that have been talked about today. So as I discussed, our process was heavily relied on the IUCN and CSIBA processes, which are based on scientific knowledge. So when traditional knowledge holders came to the table, it didn't fit the way that their worldview, the way that they viewed these different species. So really changing the system to a dual process to allowing for each component or each knowledge system to put forward their own information allowed us to communicate in a way that best fits that knowledge system. So one concrete example would be considering barren ground caribou. So in a normal scientific status report, we talk about the systematic and taxonomic classification of barren ground caribou. They're Brantford tarandus. But what does that mean for Indigenous peoples? Well, to flip that into talking with Indigenous knowledge holders and experts in the field, they changed that to how do they view the species as a whole? What do they see? How do they see the herds on the ground? And so we had, based on science in the barren ground caribou status report, we rely heavily on herd definitions of herds, while the Indigenous knowledge component looked at where are the barren ground caribou traveling, what is their range, what is their color, their body condition, and even the taste of the meat, which resulted in a different identification of herds.
And I'd like to turn quickly to Professor Littlechild. You mentioned SEPA and the implementation framework around the right to live in a healthy environment. As I understand it, that applies only within the confines of SEPA. I put forward a private member's bill that would do the same thing, but for all federal pieces of legislation. I'm just wondering if you could quickly comment on the utility of that process.
30 seconds, please.
I think it would be incredibly useful, what you're proposing. And I think the reason is that creating formalized mechanisms has really shown to provide the richest and most useful outcomes for the inclusion of Indigenous peoples. Where there are no formalized mechanisms and where we can't point to some high specificity in the context of legislation or policy, I think there's sort of less utility to those types of mechanisms. So I think expanding that beyond SEPA, which is one example, would be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. In the next round, we're going to be abbreviated. We'll do 3-3-1-1. And that will cut into our committee business time a little bit, but with the committee's indulgence, let's go ahead with 3 minutes to Mr. Tucker, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our witnesses. To Mrs. Sainine Crawford, if I'm pronouncing that right, I hope. Talking about knowledge transfers from elders and what's going on with some of the caribou herds and some of the stories that I've heard about the permafrost and the challenges with global warming, is it pretty universal with the elders have been talking about what is affecting the caribou herds in the north?
I think that we see a lot of similar testimonies coming out from different communities, but there are differences across the NWT, being that the Northwest Territories is quite vast. We have a huge area and 5 different ecotypes actually of caribou in that exist here and that people rely on. So we do see some differences, but there are some main points that continue to come out across everyone.
So, like going forward, you'll hear stories from elders talking about the challenges of dealing with warmer climates. And why I ask that is there stories from elders that talk about when the climate was colder? And I'm thinking of going way back about stories about the last time that everything was in an ice age. Is there stories from the elders that they've shared about the changing climates over the years?
So for this question, I actually think that Tammy would be best suited to
Really
speak
quickly,
to.
I know we're short in time. Tammy?
Yes, our elders have stories to talk about how the caribou in the past, during very cold temperatures, there's been both a decline and where you could see populations improving. So the climate we know is really affecting the caribou. There's also other factors that we're seeing. We're finding that with our research in the Contuido Lake area, that there's other predators coming in, such as the bald eagles. So there's a lot of different factors we feel that are affecting caribou populations in that area. Merci.
Thank you kindly.
Thank you. And now for 3 minutes, we'll go to Dr. Jacek, please.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. Ms. Littlechild, thank you again for your practical recommendations that you've made. The discussion today has very much focused on environment, on wildlife, and those particular study areas. I didn't know that, in fact, the Environment and Climate Change Canada Department had a Wildlife and Landscape Science Directorate, and we heard that their efforts are there to incorporate Indigenous knowledge. Are there other departments of the federal government that you're aware of where there are such science directorates that might also benefit from more collaboration and integration with Indigenous knowledge? I'm, of course, thinking of health, social services, that kind of area.
Yes, I think there are probably quite a few, but not having deep knowledge of the various departments within the Canadian ministries, it's difficult for me to pinpoint any precise examples.
I appreciate that. In terms of granting research dollars, obviously the federal government is involved in that. Are you at all familiar with CIHR and CIRC, etc.? And are you thinking along any lines that might provide for opportunities for more Indigenous-led research through those federal granting agencies?
I have the privilege of being a co-principal investigator with a project called the AirMat Project, which you heard about in previous testimony from Dr. Brenda Parley, who is one of my co-principal investigators in that project, which is funded through the New Frontiers in Research Transformations grant, and which is a global multi-year, multi-million-dollar project looking at Indigenous health and well-being in the context of biodiversity and conservation. And I think that funding projects such as this, which are indeed Indigenous-led and place-based, is one of the best ways to start to elevate the knowledge systems of Indigenous peoples, not only in Canada, but globally. And I think the fact that Canada is funding these types of projects and hopefully continues to do so will, in fact, influence not just policy in Canada, but also global international policy through institutions like the United Nations and others, which are looking at how to understand the place of Indigenous systems vis-a-vis other systems of knowledge and science on various environmental issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now for a minute, Mr. Blanchet-Choquin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I'll continue with you, Ms. Littlechild. You said earlier that Indigenous knowledge should be defined by Indigenous peoples themselves or by knowledge keepers. My question is the following. You say that both systems of knowledge are completely different. Does that mean that all knowledge of Western science, including hard evidence, could in a way interfere rather with Indigenous knowledge?
I think there's been really wonderful evidence presented about ways to find commonalities between knowledge systems, so I won't speak to that. But I will speak to a point that I was trying to get to earlier in your line of question, which was, which I could maybe use the exemplar of the Alberta Indigenous Wisdom Advisory Panel, where they advised the chief scientist in the government of Alberta. One of the challenges is that the chief scientist will, of course, have their own bias and limitations in how they understand the advice provided by the Indigenous Wisdom Advisory Panel, and that advice and contribution then become constrained and limited by the limited understanding and cultural values held by the chief scientist or government representatives.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Cannings, for the final minute, please.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to go back to Professor Littlechild again as well and talk about species at risk. When I've worked with Indigenous peoples on species at risk issues, they point out pretty much immediately that the Species at Risk Act federally is largely applicable only on federal lands, and in Canada that means right away Indian reserves and everything north of 60. Where we have substantial Indigenous populations that then, point out they have Indigenous knowledge that they would like to use. You use the word autonomy, and if you could just talk briefly about that, that clash of systems.
Sure. I think one of the challenges has always been how to understand systems clash. And many Indigenous scholars who are far more established and knowledgeable than I am, such as Leroy Littlebear, have talked extensively about this in their publications and in their work. But I think from my perspective, part of the challenge is that it's only been somewhat recently that we've seen sort of space being made for Indigenous systems. For many years, Indigenous systems were seen.
I think we'll cut it there because we did trap part of your thought. Unfortunately, we are over time. That's what we've been fighting all through this whole study. But if there is more that you can provide via written, it's good to get things like the study that you just mentioned over to us for the clerk and for the analysts. I'm sorry. So thank you to Danica Littlechild, Tammy Steinwald Deschambault, and to Heather Sain Crawford for your testimonies and for your contribution today. And thank you for your patience with technology. I'm really glad that we had you able to interact with us. And for now, we're going to just take a pause. You're free to leave. We're going to go into committee business now, so you could sign off Zoom, and then we will go right into committee business. Thank you. Good. I'm sorry? We've scheduled till 1:30 for committee business. So we've extended our time briefly today to talk about the travel budget. We've got until 1:30. The proposal includes provisions for 12 travelers, including 7 MPs, a clerk, 2 analysts, and 2 interpreters to visit the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories in Chalk River, Snow Lab in Sudbury, the Canadian Light Source in Saskatoon, and the Dominion Radio Astrophysical Laboratory in Caledon, BC, as well as Triumph in Vancouver, BC. Travel would take place between May 13th to 17th. And a reminder that the submission has to be sent to the Subcommittee on Budgets of the Liaison Committee by this Friday, February 16th. So do we have any comments on the budget that we have before us? Mr. Cannings?
Just briefly, it's pronounced Caledon. Just wanted to point that out. And it's mentioned there's Caledon, Penticton, Kelowna as sort of like 3 separate destinations. It's all the same place, basically. We would travel to Kelowna, probably stay in Penticton and see the center in Caledon. So
thank you.
Just
thank
like
you for giving us the regional knowledge. I know 1 out of 3 of those centers. So, yeah, very good, Ms. Jacek, Dr. Jacek.
Thank you, Chair. Being relatively new to this committee, I just wondered how this list of interesting places came about.
Okay. So it was, the original travel was a motion to the committee back in Kirsty Duncan's time, actually. And so we just duplicated what was approved by the committee at that time to see whether the current committee would approve this travel. Ms. Bradford?
So I'm happy to speak to that because it was my original motion.
Oh.
And I think Lena and I are the only surviving ones on the government side that's been there from the beginning. So this came about after, I think, probably our very initial study, which was on big science. And so that was pretty much the initial study of this committee. And we actually had witnesses from very many of these very, very interesting facilities, which I have a feeling you kind of really need to see to believe. Because of their size and uniqueness. So that's why we suggested this, and we keep putting it forward in hope.
Thank you. Any other comments around the table? Yes, Mr. Blanchet-Joca.
Chair, just to note that there's no destination in Quebec here, so we hope that next time we could have a destination in Quebec. That'd be nice. Something that is truly a scientific infrastructure. We have a lot of it. There was an original suggestion that was made 2 years ago. Is there any way to amend or to change this, or we just adopt it as is?
Deadline, we've had to draft a budget. The clerk drafted a budget based on these locations, and so that's what we have before us. And you're right, there's a lot of great science in Quebec, for sure. So we would have to redo the budget, which we don't have time to do at this point. It's kind of an all or nothing. Should we vote on the budget then? If I can call on the clerk to help us through that. Or should we do it on division? Should we? So unanimous? Okay, fantastic. I love it when a plan comes together. Thank you, committee, and thank you to the clerk for doing that. Mr. Tucker?
Sure, yeah.
Yep.
That the committee invite the Minister of Industry along with department officials to appear for 2 hours to explain why Huawei is absent from the Science and Economic Development Canada's list of named research organizations who are identified as posing a high risk to Canada's national security, and that the committee report this back to the House. That is the motion that I'd like us to vote on, and it would be a quick one committee meeting to explore why and how they can defend not having Huawei on that list that excludes identities from China operating in Canada. So I make that motion, and I hope that we have a vote on that today. We got community business for the next 20 minutes.
So we'll open that up for discussion. Mr. Turnbull.
So because we haven't had a chance, and Mr. Tucker read that fairly quickly, could we have that in both official languages sent to our emails so that we can actually read it?
I'll do one better.
I'll
I'll distribute a copy of both French and English. This is a study that we've been wanting to do for a while that we have discussed already, and I'd like to vote on that today.
I don't remember ever discussing this, Mr. Tucker, but that's fine. Maybe you can float those around, and I would appreciate a copy by email so I can actually look at it. If we want to propose an amendment potentially, that should be available, right? Yep. So maybe we could pause and wait till we get that and then return to the discussion if that's fair. I think
Yeah,
most committees,
we can
that's
pause
kind
for
of
a couple
standard.
minutes while it comes around.
Your Honor. As we wait.
No, just pause until we.
Yeah. But because we're in community business, we don't need to officially have a translation. What I've read is what I would like to vote on. So it's not a procedural thing that we need to have.
No, but if a member wants it in writing in front of them, it's a longer motion, and we haven't seen it yet. So I think that's a fair request for a member to look at.
You might think it's fair, but by the book,
Yeah, I
we're
do.
in community business. We need a vote on this today.
don't need to vote today. It's up to the committee when that vote happens.
I don't know why you're hiding. This is an
I'm not
attempt to, once again, stall why we have asked for why Huawei has not been on this list. There has been no explanation. We are the science committee that should be tasked with looking at why are post-secondary institutions still partnering with Huawei. It's been years now that we know the problems with that company and the ties to the Beijing government. We know the questions that they have been raised about some of the research that has been done as early as late last year with that identity. We are asking for just a 2-hour study. I do not understand what the government is trying to hide. These answers are going to come out, and it would be best to come out in the proper committee such as this that is looking at our post-secondary institutions and the corruption that has been permeated by actors from Beijing.
Is there more discussion on this, or do you want to go to a vote? Ms. Carabega, sorry.
Thanks. I would like to move a motion to adjourn debate.
Yeah, you can adjourn. There's a non-debatable motion to adjourn debate. Let's test the committee on that.
All right. Clarification, Lloyd. Clarification. So we are not voting on this. We are hiding again.
No,
and the cover-up
we're
continues.
voting on adjourning debate. It's
no, this
a
is the cover-up.
non-debatable
We have
motion.
20 more minutes of community time, and why you guys are hiding for Huawei
Point
is
of
beyond
order,
me.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Ms.
I
Carabega.
believe that a motion to adjourn debate does not.
That's
we don't
correct.
need to debate. Thanks.
So let's go to the vote on adjourning debate.
Mr. Turnbull.
Yes.
Dr. Jazik.
Yes.
Ms. Metledge Diab.
Yes.
Ms. Bradford.
Yes.
Ms. Kayabega.
Oui.
Mr. Tucker.
No to the cover-up.
Ms. Rempel Garner.
No.
Mr. Soroka.
No.
Mr. Lobb.
No.
Monsieur Blanchette-Jonca.
Non.
Mr. Cannings.
No.
Okay. So the debate continues.
Call the vote. Question.
The debate continues. Yes, Mr. Turnbull?
So I'm just, as I'm reading this, I'm trying to understand what the intention is here. So my understanding is that this motion is asking for why a private company is not on a list, and the list, I believe, is a list that's being referred to is for research organizations, not actually to include private companies. So I'm sort of just struggling to understand what the intention is. I think the other thing is that there is already a ban on federal funding from Huawei. So I guess just in terms of the intention of the motion, I'm a little bit confused as to why this study would be necessary and how the motion even makes sense. So maybe members from the Conservative Party who are clearly looking to grandstand on this can and potentially give us a rationale.
Well, Garner.
If they want to. Otherwise, I can keep talking.
So when I looked at the named research organizations list that came out, first of all, I'll note that the government took a long time to put that list out, much longer than they said it was going to take. And what ended up happening was another round of, another season of research granting cycle went through, and we've heard in testimony here that there has been partnerships that have happened ostensibly with organizations that are now on the list. We've not had the minister in front of the committee to testify how this list was developed, what criteria were used, and also the other thing, just to Mr. Turnbull's comments, when we think about companies in the Canadian context under Canadian law, that doesn't necessarily neatly overlie state-owned enterprises that have direct links with let's say, communist government. That's not what the term company means. So when we talk about research entities and countries and government organizations, in other governmental systems, a company can be a state-run enterprise. So I think it does behoove this committee, given that this was the topic of much discussion in many witness testimony over the last year, to understand what the government's rationale was on whether or not they were allowing certain companies to participate, and again, companies in air quotes, to participate in research funding in Canada and not. I think this would provide clarity for Canada's universities. It does seem a little vague to me, and I'd love the opportunity to question officials on this matter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Tucker?
Yes, just before the vote, we have 12 minutes left to have this vote today, unless we're wanting to cover this up again. And this is what I think the Liberals are attempting to do with any inquiry into why Huawei has been getting special access, or why we would be partnering with an identity like that, because it's proven to be questionable for our safety and security. This is a pretty straightforward one meeting, 2 hours with officials to find out why this Beijing-linked organization was not on the list. And if we don't vote on this, I think it's pretty clear that this is a Liberal cover-up again. Now it's not science. I'll end it there.
Okay, thank you for that. We have Ms. Bradford and then Ms. Jazik on the speaking list.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. With all due respect, I think the reason that we don't want to take 2 hours to bring the minister back was he already dealt with this the last time he was there, and we have mechanisms in place to make sure that there aren't partnerships with Huawei. If it's a university one, the new regulation with lists will capture it and prevent it from happening. If it's an industry partnership, the alliance regulations will capture it. So it's basically a moot point, and we haven't approved anything with Huawei since the fall of 2022. So I really don't see the need to, take up more committee time, 2 hours to bring the minister back to deal with something that's already been dealt with by other means.
Okay, Dr. Jazik.
Well, in a similar vein, as I understand it, that this isn't the only mechanism that we have. As my colleague has said, the minister made it very clear that any decision on Huawei would be through the Alliance Program Research Security Regulation. Again, trying to wrestle with some of the legislation that is available. And that this was flagged back in 2022. And so we do have tools to use already in terms of ensuring that we assure our security is intact.
Thank you. Mr. Turnbull?
Yeah, the other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that the list that we're talking about was created by public safety. So, when public safety does the work behind the scenes to come up with a list of entities or research organizations, certainly they did their due diligence on that. A ban on Huawei funding research in Canada was already in place. The government had already made a decision on that. We have a research security framework that I know members are well aware of. So it's what's interesting to me is we'd be calling a minister back who wasn't the minister really doing the work on creating the list of research organizations. So it's kind of interesting that this only focuses on the Minister of Industry rather than the Minister of Public Safety or both. And that's, just I think it's a missed opportunity perhaps for the Conservatives, but I agree with my colleagues that this seems to be sort of a moot point because we've been so clear about no research funding from Huawei. And the research organizations seem to include a list of post-secondary institutions, so for the most part. So I think that if Mr. Tucker wants to provide some additional clarification, that's fine, or I can keep going.
Okay, well, Mr. Tucker is on the speaking list, so we'll go to him next.
This is really telling that you would go this far to protect Huawei. This is very telling that the Liberal Party of Canada will not have a meeting on understanding one of the biggest risks that we have to our security and communications, and that you're shutting down that debate, that you're shutting down a committee investigating a company that one would have to assume must have the dirt on some Liberals, because that's the only reason why every Liberal is defending Huawei and refusing to study this. This is very telling, Chair.
Okay, I was going to say that we'd run out of their speaking list, but Ms. Metledge-Diab?
Thank you. I with respect, I can't believe I'm hearing Mr. Tucker say what he just said. This committee, these members on this side, and I'm sure on the other side, nobody has any intention to protect the company. My colleagues, 1, 2, 3, at least of them have tried to convey the reasoning for not taking a committee time to do something that is really not in the mandate of this committee. 1, 2, this minister, this is not his mandate. He was not the one, and that department is not the one that created that list. There are so precious little time that we get to meet in this committee to truly try and work and understand and get witnesses and do studies on science and research, that I find it really, whatever the word is, I'm not happy with, to try and really waste time with things that are not related to the committee that we decided to join in the first place. And as my colleague, Ms. Bradford, says, we were here from the beginning, so were some of you on the other side, but the reasoning we put our hands and wanted to be on this historic original committee was because we truly valued and felt there was something we can do to contribute to science and research in Canada. In English et aussi en français. Alors, pour moi,
to take the time, and it's really time we don't have in this committee to plan studies, to call witnesses, and to talk to witnesses who really want to talk about science and research. There's so many studies that I would like to propose to the committee, but we have very limited time.
From the beginning, to take turns with political parties. And so therefore, when it comes to our side here, there's just really no time for us to even have any studies put forward. So that's where I would like to see our energies and our time spent, that we can truly, use this time here beneficially, so that we can do things on this committee that, frankly, cannot be done in other committees. There's over 30 standing committees at the House of Commons. Surely there's better committees to study some of these other things that keep popping up on this committee that is not the mandate of the Science and Research Committee, and not the mandate of when it was created. Mr. Turnbull, I think you had your hand up, but I mean, I could go on because you did, Dr. Jazik, sorry, because I'm really, I don't want to say a lot more, but once in a while, and every X number of months, I really do get passionate about this topic, because I was one of the original people that said to my whip, this is the committee I'd like to be on when I got elected. And the reason is to do things that I believe are valuable in the science and research community that I have not seen done before. And so this is where I would like us to use the valuable, precious time that we have here.
Dr. Jazik.
Thank you, Chair. And I certainly echo what I heard from my colleague, Ms. Diab. I'm extremely anxious to get on with the study proposed by Monsieur Blanchet-Jonca as an example. I think this is appropriate use of the time of this particular committee. Furthermore, as we have said, the Government of Canada has made a very firm statement when it comes to Huawei. In fact, I'll quote from a statement made by the Honourable François-Philippe Champagne, Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, on May 19th, 2022. And that statement reads, "Today, the Government of Canada is ensuring the long-term safety of our telecommunications infrastructure. As part of that, the government intends to prohibit the inclusion of Huawei and ZTE products and services in Canada's telecommunications systems. This follows a thorough review by our independent security agencies and in consultation with our closest allies. As a result, telecommunications companies that operate in Canada would no longer be permitted to make use of designated equipment or services provided by Huawei and ZTE as well. Companies that already use this equipment installed in their networks would be required to cease its use and remove it. The government intends to implement these measures as part of a broader agenda to promote the security of Canada's telecommunications networks and in consultation with industry." And it's a firm commitment, and the quote again from Minister Champagne, "Our government will always protect the safety and security of Canadians and will take any actions necessary to safeguard our critical telecommunications infrastructure." I think this is crystal clear, and I think it's a misuse of the time of this particular committee to proceed in the way that this motion suggests.
Okay. Mr. Turnbull, but very briefly, because I have a few comments I'd like to make before we adjourn.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and thanks to my colleagues for those comments. I think we have a block study which is next in the rotation, which is a great study, the U15 and more equitably distributing funding perhaps for research in Canada, which I think is a great study. I think we have proposed our Arctic study, Arctic research study, which in terms of our rotation, which is the agreement on this committee, which I think is a testament to how this committee functions, which is in a very collaborative, open, thoughtful way. In terms of this particular motion, I mean, perhaps the Conservatives want to have one meeting on this topic as their study in the rotation, but my feeling is we have numerous studies that are before there's time for an additional Conservative motion. So I think from my perspective, Chair, this is sort of jumping the gun in terms of wanting to insert a motion in the agenda that's already been agreed upon with study after study, which I think accounts for much of our time for a number of weeks to come.
Okay,
so maybe I'll leave it there because I noticed that you want to jump in, but I do have more to say on this.
Okay, we have reached our time. We're meeting on Thursday to provide our analysts drafting instructions for the study report on Indigenous traditional knowledge and science, and also setting a deadline for written briefs on that. We also want to look at the draft report on the pay impacts on Canadian universities. The clerk has circulated a draft report on that. Also, I'd like to know from the committee, maybe Thursday we can address this on the Chief Science Office Advisor's appearance on Thursday the 27th, whether we'd like her to be here for 1 hour or 2 hours. So if we can pick up the conversation on that on Thursday.
That's in camera. That we have to be out of camera for the discussion on this motion, though.
Okay.
Other than that, that's a cover-up.
Okay. So thank you, committee. Motion to adjourn. I see Richard is leaving. Adjourn.